$500 a day, the absurd fine she levied as if the law would bend to her will at the mere sound of her voice. No formal notice, no written record, no due process. Just a hastily printed piece of paper filled with ridiculous terms of her own making. But what angered me most was the smug look in her eyes as she stood in the middle of the crowd, preaching morality as if she were the gatekeeper of order. She thought her presence was the law. She believed fear would keep me down. But this time she picked the wrong target. I would not back down. And when the drama of power collapsed, she would be the one to count the price of her arrogance 2 years ago. I moved to this quiet town for a slower pace of life, leaving behind the hustle and bustle of the big city, with my long brown hair tied back and my business casual attire. Most people would assume I was just another quiet consultant at a small local firm. My name is Sarah Mitchell, 31 across town. Karen Morrison, 34, has been president of the Willowbrook Heights HOA for 3 years, with her perfectly styled blonde hair and immaculate attire. She runs the neighborhood like a corporate boardroom, but today she ended up picking the wrong person to threaten. It all started on a crisp October morning when I decided to build a small storage shed on the empty lot I purchased. 6 months earlier, the lot sat at the end of Maple Street, bordered by a small wooded area that stretched toward the old creek. Perfect for my gardening plans, I had spent weeks researching the property, checking zoning laws and obtaining all necessary permits from the city. Everything was legal and above board. The first conflict erupted when I began clearing the overgrown weeds and brambles I was kneed in thorny vines, when Karen appeared marching across the street with purpose. She clutched a colorful printed paper in her manicured hands. Her face set in that familiar expression of righteous indignation I'd seen her use on other neighbors. "Excuse me, what exactly do you think you're doing here?" she demanded, positioning herself between me and my wheelbarrow full of debris. I straightened up, pulling off my work gloves. "Good morning, Karen. I'm clearing my lot to begin construction on a storage shed." "Well, that's simply not going to happen," she declared, waving the paper like a court summon. "The HOA doesn't allow any construction on that lot because it would affect the overall landscape of our community." I politely explained that I'd thoroughly checked the HOA regulations before purchasing the property, even reviewing the original covenant documents from 1992. But Karen cut me off with a dismissive wave. "The rules were just updated last week at an emergency board meeting. This lot has been designated as a protected green space." When I asked to see the official update and meeting minutes, Karen's confidence wavered slightly. She spoke vaguely about an emergency session that apparently I wasn't invited to attend despite being a property owner in the area. Something felt distinctly off about her story, but I decided to pause my work and investigate further as I loaded my tools back into my truck. I could see Karen watching from her front window, phone pressed to her ear. I had a feeling this was just the beginning. 3 days later, I returned to continue my project after finding absolutely no official notice about new regulations in my mailbox email or posted anywhere in the neighborhood. I'd even called the city planning office to double-check my permits. Everything was still valid and in order. Karen appeared within minutes of my arrival, this time accompanied by 2 other people I recognized as HOA board members: Patricia Webb, a stern-faced woman in her 50s, and David Chen, a nervous-looking accountant who seemed uncomfortable with the confrontation. "Miss Mitchell, you were explicitly told to stop this project," Karen announced, her voice carrying across the quiet street. Several neighbors had come out to their porches, drawn by the commotion. "Since you've chosen to ignore official HOA directives, we're implementing immediate financial penalty." Patricia stepped forward with an official-looking document. "You'll be fined $500 per day for every day you continue this unauthorized construction," she declared, her voice dripping with authority. David fidgeted with his clipboard, avoiding eye contact. I examined the document they thrust at me. It was printed on Karen's home computer with formatting that looked more like a high school project than official legal paperwork. "This isn't legally binding," I pointed out calmly, "and I'd like to see the recorded vote where the board approved these penalties." Karen's face flushed red. "We don't need your approval for standard enforcement actions," but I noticed David's uncomfortable expression and Patricia's sudden interest in her fingernails. They knew something wasn't right that afternoon. I found photos of myself on the neighborhood social media group. Karen had captured me mid-swing with a pickaxe, making me look like some kind of property destroyer. Her caption read, "New resident disregards community regulations, destroying our shared living environment. This is what happens when we don't maintain standards." The comments were brutal. Neighbors I had barely met were calling me selfish and inconsiderate. Mrs. Henderson from Three Houses Down wrote that people like this were ruining property values. I felt the sting of isolation as judgmental stares followed me during my evening walk. But I also began questioning the legality of these so-called new regulations more seriously. By the following week, I'd had enough of Karen's games. I took a day off work and drove to the county courthouse where public records were maintained. The clerk, a friendly woman named Betty, helped me access the official HOA documentation. What I discovered was fascinating. The property records showed my lot wasn't actually within the official boundaries of Willowbrook Heights HOA, according to the legal survey. From 2008, the HOA's jurisdiction ended 50 feet before my property line. It seemed the boundaries had been misunderstood for years, possibly due to an informal agreement that was never legally recorded. Armed with this information, I approached Karen at her pristine colonial house. She was tending to her award-winning rose garden wearing spotless gardening gloves that clearly saw more fashion than function. "Karen, we need to talk," I said, holding up the official boundary map. "I've discovered something interesting about my property." When I explained the boundary issue and showed her the county records, her perfectly composed mania cracked. "That's ridiculous. You're deliberately complicating a simple issue," she snapped, standing abruptly and scattering rose petals. "Your lot has always been part of this community, and I won't let you use some technicality to destroy our neighborhood standards." I remained calm but firm. "It's not a technicality, Karen, it's the law. Your HOA has no jurisdiction over my property." Her response was to threaten legal action. "I'm calling my lawyer first thing Monday morning, and I'll see you in court for destroying communal property." As I walked away, I heard her slam her front door hard enough to rattle the windows through her kitchen window. I could see her pacing back and forth, phone pressed to her ear. The war was escalating. Karen made good on her threat. On Wednesday morning, a city building inspector named Tom Rodriguez arrived at my lot with a clipboard and a confused expression. "Ma'am, I received a complaint about unpermitted construction," he said apologetically. "I have to investigate, but I have to tell you, your permits all look good in our system." Tom was thorough, checking my documentation and walking the property boundaries with a measuring tape. After 20 minutes, he shook his head. "Everything's in order here. Your permits are valid, the construction is within code, and honestly, the complaint doesn't make much sense." He paused, studying his notes. "The person who called in claimed you were building on HOA common property, but according to our records, this lot is privately owned and outside the HOA boundaries." That afternoon, Karen's social media campaign intensified. She posted a long rant about how I was a threat to property values and completely disrespectful to the community that welcomed me. She claimed I was trying to destroy the character of our neighborhood and urged people to take action before it's too late. The post generated dozens of comments, most of them negative toward me. People who'd never spoken to me were making assumptions about my character and motives. Some suggested I should move somewhere more appropriate for people who don't respect community standards. I found myself avoiding the grocery store and local coffee shop. Tired of the whispered conversations that stopped when I entered, Karen had effectively turned me into a pariah in my own neighborhood, but her campaign was about to backfire in ways she never expected. The situation reached its breaking point on a foggy Thursday morning. I arrived at my lot at 7 a.m. to meet the contractors who were delivering lumber for the shed's frame. Instead, I found Karen standing guard at the property entrance, arms crossed, blocking the narrow access road. "Not bringing any more equipment onto this property," she declared as my contractors arrived in their truck. "I've called the police and they're on their way to handle this trespassing situation." The contractors, two middle-aged men named Frank and Joe, looked confused. "Ma'am, we have a legitimate work order and building permits," Frank said patiently. "We're not trespassing anywhere." Karen's voice rose to a near shout. "This is HOA property. She has no right to build here." She waved her phone dramatically. "I'm documenting everything for the lawsuit." That's when I'd had enough, looking at Karen standing there red-faced and righteously indignant, blocking honest workers from doing their job. I realized she'd crossed a line. She wasn't just attacking me anymore. She was interfering with legal commerce and potentially harassing innocent contractor Karen. "You need to move," I said quietly. Now my tone must have conveyed something that made the contractor step back slightly. Karen, however, doubled down. "I will not be intimidated by some newcomer who thinks she can waltz in here and ignore our community standards." She shrieked, "This is my neighborhood, and I've been protecting it long before you arrived." As if on cue, two police officers arrived in response to Karen's call. Officer Martinez, a calm professional in his 40s, assessed the situation quickly. After reviewing my permits, checking the property boundaries on his tablet, and listening to Karen's increasingly frantic explanations, he delivered his verdict. "Ma'am," he said to Karen, "Miss Mitchell has every legal right to build on her property. If you continue to interfere with lawful construction activities, I'll have to cite you for disturbing the peace." Karen's face went white, then red, then white again. That's when I realized Karen had pushed too far, and it was time to stop hiding who I really was. Maybe it was time she learned she was trying to intimidate someone who had spent years drafting regulations for dozens of HOAs and knew every legal loophole she was attempting to exploit that evening. I sat in my home office, opened my laptop, and began the investigation I should have conducted months ago, with 10 years of experience in urban planning and municipal law. I knew exactly where to look and what questions to ask. My first discovery was damning. Willowbrook Heights HOA hadn't filed mandatory annual financial reports with the state for 2 consecutive years, a serious violation that could result in the organization losing its legal nonprofit status. Furthermore, there were no official meeting minutes on file regarding any rule changes in the past 18 months. I dug deeper into the HOA's corporate filings and found irregularities everywhere. Board positions hadn't been properly elected according to the bylaws, financial transparency requirements were being ignored, and several decisions appeared to have been made unilaterally by Karen, without board approval. My second step involved reaching out to other residents through carefully crafted conversations. I organized a casual neighborhood coffee morning and was shocked by what I learned. Karen had raised HOA fees by 40% over 2 years without holding required votes, and many neighbors felt frustrated but didn't know how to challenge her authority. Mrs. Patterson, an elderly widow, confided that Karen had threatened to fine her $300 for hanging laundry outside, something that wasn't actually prohibited in the original HOA covenant. The Rodriguez family shared that Karen had tried to ban their vegetable garden, claiming it violated aesthetic standards that existed nowhere in writing. Most significantly, I met Jim Peterson, a retired attorney who lived at the end of Elm Street. Jim had tried to challenge some of Karen's decisions legally, but had been brushed off with claims that questioning board authority was disruptive to community harmony. "I've been practicing law for 35 years, Jim told me quietly, "and I've never seen such blatant disregard for proper governance procedures." But Karen's convinced everyone that challenging her means destroying the neighborhood. The breakthrough came from the last person I expected on a rainy Tuesday evening. Mike Morrison knocked on my door. Karen's husband looked exhausted, his usually neat appearance disheveled, his eyes red, rimmed with stress. "Sarah, I need to talk to you," he said, glancing nervously over his shoulder toward his house. "It's about Karen and everything that's been happening." I invited him in for coffee, sensing this conversation would be important. Her wife has completely lost perspective. Mike began, his hands shaking slightly as he held his mug. "She's always been controlling, but this situation with you has pushed her over the edge. She's obsessed with staying up until 3 in the morning, researching property law and drafting new regulations." He paused, seeming to gather courage. "Sarah, Karen has been falsifying documents. She's created fake meeting minutes to justify rule changes that were never voted on. She's even transferred HOA funds to pay for her legal research and what she calls enforcement activities." Mike reached into a manila envelope he brought with him. "I found these on our shared computer. I know I shouldn't be showing you this, but what she's doing is wrong, and I can't be part of it anymore." The documents were explosive, email threads showing Karen instructing board members to just go along with necessary changes, bank transfers moving HOA funds to personal accounts, draft regulations written in Karen's distinctive style, backdated to appear office. Most damaging was an email to Patricia Webb stating, "We can't let Sarah Mitchell set a precedent that residents can ignore community standards if we don't stop her now. Other people will think they can do whatever they want. Mike, why are you showing me this? I asked gently. He looked up with tired eyes because I married someone I thought was principled and community-minded. This person, he gestured toward his house. This isn't the woman I fell in love with. Power has corrupted her completely. But the next morning I made a phone call I'd been considering for weeks. Lisa Williams answered on the second ring, her voice brightening when she recognized mine. Sarah Mitchell. What are you doing in small-town USA? Lisa had been an investigative reporter for the Metro Herald when we worked together on municipal planning stories. Now she worked for a regional paper that specialized in local government accountability, learning to live at a slower pace. I laughed, but it seems some old professional problems have followed me here. When I explained the situation with Karen in the HOA, Lisa's journalistic instincts kicked in immediately. Sarah, this is exactly the kind of story I've been wanting to write: small-scale government corruption, abuse of volunteer power, legal intimidation of residents. It's got everything. She paused, but I have to ask, why didn't you just use your professional background to shut this down months ago? I considered the question. Honestly, I wanted to try living as a regular person for once. No leveraging connections, no pulling professional strings. I wanted to see if I could just be Sarah, the consultant, not Sarah, the former city planning director. And how's that working out? Lisa asked with amusement. Terribly, which is why I'm calling you within hours. Lisa had begun preliminary research on Willowbrook Heights HOA. Her findings confirmed my discoveries and revealed additional problems I hadn't uncovered. Karen's board had been making decisions that affected hundreds of residents without proper authority, transparency, or legal backing. My most shocking discovery came when I decided to re-examine my original property purchase documents with my professional eye instead of my naive newcomer perspective. I'd bought the lot through what I'd assumed was a standard real estate transaction, but the details told a different story. The seller wasn't a private party, it was the city of Millbrook itself, through a program called Community Green Space Development Initiative. The city had been selling strategic lots to residents who committed to creating community beneficial projects like gardens, small parks, or educational spaces. This meant my shed wasn't just a personal storage building, it was part of an official city program designed to enhance community life. Karen hadn't just been harassing a private citizen, she'd been interfering with a municipal development project. But the revelation that changed everything was buried in the fine print of my purchase agreement. The city had designated my lot as outside all existing HOA jurisdictions, specifically to prevent community organizations from blocking beneficial development projects. In other words, Karen's interference wasn't just legally wrong, it was potentially criminal. She was obstructing a city-sponsored community improvement project, which could result in serious legal consequences. I sat back in my chair, stunned by the implications. Karen had no idea she'd been trying to intimidate someone who had not only helped design this exact type of program in her previous job, but who was now implementing one of these projects herself. The woman who'd spent months claiming I was destroying community standards was actually the one violating community development laws. The irony was almost too perfect. With all my evidence compiled, I made one final preparation for what I knew would be a decisive confrontation. I contacted Robert Hayes Millbrook's director of urban planning, whom I'd worked with on several regional projects during my city career. I heard you'd moved to our area, Robert said warmly. How are you settling in? When I explained the situation, his tone shifted to concern. Wait, you're the Sarah Mitchell who bought lot 17 on Maple Street. That's one of our flagship community green space properties. We've been wondering why there hadn't been any progress reports. I explained Karen's interference, and Robert's reaction was immediate. Sarah, this is serious. That woman has been obstructing an official city development project. We need to resolve this immediately. He agreed to attend the emergency HOA meeting. It's a legal violation that invalidates the organization's official status. I continued calmly, which means every decision made by this board in the past 2 years, including all fines, rule changes, and enforcement actions, has no legal authority. I projected the official boundary map onto the screen I'd brought. Furthermore, my property is not within the legal jurisdiction of this HOA. As you can see, the official survey shows my lot is 53 feet outside the HOA boundaries. Robert Hayes stood up. I can confirm Miss Mitchell's findings. The city records clearly show her property is outside HOA jurisdiction. Additionally, Miss Mitchell purchased her lot through our Community Green Space Development Program, making her project an official city initiative. The revelation hit the room like a bomb. Residents began talking among themselves, their voices rising as the implications became clear. And the most serious issue, I continued pulling out bank statements and email printouts, involves financial irregularities and falsified documentation. I displayed evidence of Karen's unauthorized fund transfers and fabricated meeting minutes. Jim Peterson stood up as a practicing attorney for 35 years. I must state that these actions constitute potential criminal violations, including embezzlement and fraud. Karen's face had gone from confident pink to panicked white. This is a conspiracy. You're all attacking me because I've tried to maintain community standards. Standards, Mrs. Patterson stood up, her voice shaking with anger. Karen, you've terrorized this neighborhood for 3 years. You've raised our fees without permission, threatened to sue families for gardening, and now we discover you've been stealing our money. What happened next was swift and decisive. Jim Peterson called for an immediate vote of no confidence in the current HOA board. Lisa Williams documented everything, her camera capturing Karen's meltdown as the votes were tallied. The result was devastating: 42 votes to remove Karen from office, 1 vote in support, presumably by Karen herself, and 2 abstentions, but the community wasn't finished. Mrs. Henderson, who'd initially supported Karen's position, stood up with tears in her eyes. I owe Sarah an apology. I posted terrible things about her online, based on Karen's lies. Sarah, I'm so sorry. One by one, other residents began speaking up. The Rodriguez family talked about Karen's harassment over their vegetable garden. The Patels described being fined for having too many cars in their own driveway. The stories painted a picture of systematic abuse of authority. Karen made one final attempt to maintain control. Fine, you want to destroy this community. See how you like it when property values plummet and this neighborhood turns into chaos? She grabbed her purse and stormed toward the exit. Karen, I called out, my voice carrying clearly across the silent room. She stopped but didn't turn around. You'll be hearing from the district attorney's office about the financial irregularities. I'd recommend getting a good lawyer. The door slammed behind her with enough force to rattle the windows. Lisa Williams approached me afterward. Sarah, this is going to be front-page news. The fall of a neighborhood dictator. It's got everything: abuse of power, financial fraud, and a spectacular public downfall. Jim Peterson was already organized in a transition committee to restructure the HOA properly. Sarah, we need your expertise to rebuild this organization. The right way. Will you consider serving as interim president? Looking around the room at faces that had transformed from suspicious to grateful, I realized that sometimes you can't escape who you are. I tried to be just another resident, but my professional background and sense of justice wouldn't let me stand by while a community was being abused. I'll help. I said, but we're going to do this right. Complete transparency, democratic procedures, and actual community service. 6 months later, Wilburg Heights had been transformed. Karen and Mike's house stood empty with a for sale sign, though I'd heard through neighborhood gossip that they'd divorced and she'd moved out of state to avoid the criminal charges my lot had become. Exactly what the city's Community Green Space Program intended: a beautiful community garden where families could grow vegetables, children could learn about agriculture, and neighbors could gather for seasonal festivals. The small shed I'd originally planned to build had evolved into a community resource center stocked with gardening tools, seeds, educational materials, and even a small library of books about sustainable living. Under new leadership, the HOA had been completely restructured. We'd written transparent bylaws, established democratic voting procedures, and created a community bill of rights protecting residents from arbitrary rule enforcement. Most importantly, we'd reduced fees by 30% by eliminating Karen's unauthorized expenditures. Mrs. Patterson had become our unofficial head gardener, sharing her decades of experience with anyone interested in learning. The Rodriguez family now ran weekend workshops, teaching children about environmental science. Even Jim Peterson had taken up beekeeping, installing hives that helped pollinate the entire neighborhood. To know, Lisa Williams said when she visited to write a follow-up story, this has become a model for community organization reform. I've had inquiries from neighborhoods across 3 states asking how you did it. I'd started a small consulting practice, helping other communities resolve HOA disputes and implement proper governance procedures. It seemed my attempt to escape my professional identity had instead led me to a more fulfilling version of the same work. Mike Morrison stopped by occasionally to help with garden maintenance. He seemed like a different person without Karen's constant tension and control. I should have stood up to her years ago, he told me while we planted tomatoes, but I kept thinking she'd realize she'd gone too far and change on her own. He paused, wiping dirt from his hands. Thank you for having the courage. I didn't have our first annual community harvest festival. Drew over 300 people from Millbrook and surrounding towns. Local newspapers covered the event, and the mayor gave a speech about the importance of grassroots community development. Standing on the small stage we erected near the oak tree that anchored our garden, I looked out at families playing together, neighbors sharing recipes and children learning about the plants they'd helped grow a year ago. This was just an empty lot that became the center of a neighborhood conflict. I said into the microphone today, it's the heart of a community that learned how to work together with respect, transparency, and genuine care for each other. The applause was warm and genuine, coming from people who'd lived through the transformation themselves after the festival as volunteers cleaned up and the last families headed home. I sat on the wooden bench we'd installed under the oak tree. A small brass plaque on the bench read, "Dedicated by the Willowbrook Heights community in honor of Sarah Mitchell, who taught us that true leadership means serving others." Jim Peterson found me there as the sun was setting. "Regrets about getting involved?" he asked, settling onto the bench beside me. I considered the question. None. I came here trying to be someone I'm not, just another quiet resident minding her own business. But when I saw Karen abusing people who couldn't fight back, I couldn't stay silent, and I realized that running away from who you are doesn't work. I'm someone who knows how to fight injustice and build better systems. Trying to pretend otherwise was just selfish. As darkness fell, and the solar lights we'd installed throughout the garden began to glow softly, I reflected on the journey that had brought us here. Karen had tried to stop me from building a simple shed, but her opposition had led to something far more valuable. A genuine community built on mutual respect and democratic principles. Sometimes the worst conflicts open the path to the best outcome. Sometimes standing up for your own rights means standing up for everyone's rights. And sometimes the person trying to silence you actually gives you the loudest voice of all in trying to destroy what I was building. Karen had helped me build something far better than I'd ever imagined. The shed was just storage space, but the community we'd created would last for generations. That I realized was the real victory.